name's Glyn Pooley, and I'd like to talk about art. This time, my subject is...
So, we'll have a look at the work of three primarily watercolor painters today who have a particular interest in nature, whether that be forests or plants. Some, like Haines, like to paint animals as well, but they have certain interesting techniques. So we'll just scan through them and we'll have a little chat about their techniques as we go along and the kind of way they go about creating their artwork. So first one is Anne Brockley. She is, maybe most of you have heard of her work or seen her work in books and things, or even her dad, who was a watercolor painter as well. His name was G. John Brockley. The G actually stands for Gwilym, so there was a Welsh connection. And if you saw his work, you see he did a lot of work in the South Wales valleys as well. But he really passed on his techniques to Anne, who went and studied graphic design and illustration. And then she absorbed herself in the landscape. So we'll see a lot of techniques being used this evening. So in this picture, for example, although watercolor is the primary element that holds it all together, you're also seeing collage being used. If you can see these shapes, if the arrow can point to it, you see the arrow pointing to it. And the little white edges on these shapes of watercolor paper, they are collage over the top of watercolor paper, fairly heavy, that's been washed over the whole surface. And the textures, like you can see on these different shapes, have come about by using things like cling film. And I know a few of you have experimented with that because it creates a happy accident kind of shape. And then she's used a certain key palette, as you can see, these blues and purples, and then stuck the one layer on top of another layer. Now, this is sort of builds up a surface, which makes it particularly interesting. The white of the flower, the primrose, that's the white of the paper. So at the beginning, she'd have to plan the structure of the picture overall, So we're going to see a couple of these artists who are using like these thumbnail sketches to put this construction together. So rather than just drawing it out and then just letting the paint, the washes take shape, although that is part of the picture, you can see she starts to engage with these layering up techniques, as well as using things which will give a kind of arbitrary kind of mark, which is interesting. And then the picture just gets a certain level of richness. So I think, one of the key things today when we're looking at the watercolor will be experimentation and freedom. Those two things are particularly prevalent in this work. To find things, to find happy accidents, and to find what the medium can actually do and push the medium further along. So in this next one, it's a little bit more traditional in a way, although I know a lot of you say to me that it's sometimes hard in your watercolors to loosen up enough. And that comes from freedom, experimentation, and not being too precious about how the picture comes together. So you can see in this picture, which is two very dominant flower shapes, top left-hand one is very clearly painted wet in wet. And that just creates some nice effects on the paper. So, as I said before in the class, that we have to make sure that our materials are our friend. So, if you put watercolor on certain papers, it kind of reacts differently to others. So it's good to experiment with a few watercolor papers. Some of you have a favorite paper. Others have go-to ones, like we mentioned Bockingford's course. They're always a good go-to picture. Saunders Waterford. Some are hot pressed or cold pressed. Generally, as we said, the hot pressed will resolve a wetness to a line, whereas the cold pressed will give you more of an edge. So it's good just to experiment with how the watercolor operates on a piece of paper, because that gives you your first layer of interest. Okay. So in this, as well as the wet in wet quality of the flower, you can see she's used the end of a brush to push paint around on this flower. Yeah. And while the paint is wet as well, as you can see up here, she's used the brush to kind of thin end of the brush and sometimes the handle to push the paint around. If you push the paint around with the handle, it resolves to a dark mark. So that adds extra interest. And then, some of you talk about the cauliflowers you get in your pictures sometimes. So they can be utilized, as you can see here. So that's just surface tension between two colors. So if you just put one area that's slightly wetter than the other, the paint will be drawn to the edge of that wetter area, and then it'll resolve into the color next to it. So that's all about this open experimentation. All these things, can, like, if you're free enough and you just got like a simple subject, in this case, 2 flowers, you can see what the paint will do. It's being open enough to allow the paint to do what it wants rather than trying to control it too much. And one of the things that part of this process is using enough paint as well. If your paint is too thin or too dry, in this technique, it can't move around enough. Okay. And it's all about watching the paint move around the surface and seeing what kind of effects are created. This becomes even more important when we'll start to layer up areas as well. So it's experimentation, it's freedom, it's being aware of the surface you're working on, so you can test your paint on a surface before you make your bigger painting. Okay, it's having a basic structure. In these cases, simple structures, 2 flowers and a couple of leaves, that will enable you then to just let the materials speak rather than a detailed drawing. So you're almost like getting into a place where you're kind of playing with these materials. So again, this is another one. 1 or 2 of the images are not as sharp as I'd like them to be. It's hard because of the copyright sometimes to get a good image, particularly with a couple of these artists, because obviously they want you to buy their books. So, but I've done my best to get some which are really sharp and others, not too bad. But we can see the same kind of process happening here. She's chosen just 1 or 2 very strong shapes and then just let the paint run around the outside. So as well as the paint being wet and wet around this main shape, as you can see in the center of the shape, she will lift off the paint. So one of the best tools to use, without doubt, most versatile tools, is kitchen roll. Okay, not toilet roll, because it breaks very easily and it doesn't create such an interesting texture. But kitchen roll, absorbent kitchen roll, is very good for that, because you can just dab it into different shapes, or you can move the paint, or you can lift out paint, creating different areas in your picture of damp areas and wet areas. And then if you've got a damp area and a wet area when you're playing and you put paint on it, of course, it pulls the paint around differently. So we're just talking about different ways to move the paint around in this case. It's got definite shapes and, a relatively subdued but connected color palette. 2 secondary colors, fundamentally, the purples and the greens. We know they work well together. So those are the kind of experiments she might do before she starts, as well as a thumbnail sketch of a couple of key elements to the picture and pencil. So she's clear about the composition. Then she'll experiment with a few colours to see how they work together. And then we'll see in a couple of ones later now where she's drawing those sources from. Okay. So another kind of way of putting the paint on here. In something like this, we've got a whole series of washes, wet washes, have gone over the whole surface, from the blues to the ochres to the greens and everything like that. Okay. On top, but before that, you can see all these little white marks. Now, they can be put on with masking fluid. Now, some of you have used masking fluid, depending on the size of your image. It can be put on with anything from a cocktail stick to a nib of an ink pen, or sometimes, if the areas are bigger, an old brush. But it just retains the white of the paper. So that's one way of creating this and maintaining this light area. Some of you probably experimented with other ways as well. These days we got white acrylic pens as well, which can create a very fine mark, which can be painted on top of dry watercolor. But if we're trying to get the white of the paper to shine through, which is more traditional, we need to maintain that clear area. So masking fluid can do that. Put on finely. Then the wet and wet areas go round the outside, as we all wet and wet. And then she's flicked some paint around as well, with a bristle brush close to the surface. Throw that near the surface, and then it will break on the wet areas. Depending how wet the areas are, will depend on how much texture you get. The drier it is, the more defined it will be. The wetter it is, the softer it will be. So it's just, again, it's experimenting. You can see this is just a simple shape to play around with, so these things can happen. And then later on, she starts to experiment more with some other techniques. We've got this layering up effect starting to happen here. So we got wet and wet, background and suggestion of distance and land here, foreground. So she splits the pictures up. You see these little lines basically come together in a couple of pictures. We'll see. And then she uses actual bits of nature that she finds around in these woodlands or around her house, like these ferns, and she'll paint on top of them with some thick watercolor paint, often mixed with ink. Okay, because Indian ink is more sticky, it's got shellac in it. And then she'll just lay that onto a dry surface or a damp surface, and you see that it just leaves this stencil shape. So that's a nice way of building up a texture, as well as engaging and being close to nature. Okay. Another way she can do that as well is by putting gesso. Like we use gesso to texture a canvas or acrylic painting. You can do it watercolor as well. You can paint gesso on the surface of your watercolor paper. And it just gives you, it's white, but it's got a little bit more texture to it. So then you could press a leaf or press a fern or anything like that into the gesso, peel it off, and it'll leave a slight indentation. Let it dry, and then you paint your watercolors over the top of that. So you get all these little different textures effects that kind of built up. Again, she's keeping a simple structure, just two areas, a light area in the distance, and a land and a sky suggestion. And that by doing that, she can experiment with these different effects. Once those are down and dry, you can just put another layer of watercolor over this area if you want, just to add a little bit of transparency in some parts. Those colors there. So, another one we've got, which is taking on some of those techniques as well, is you can see same kind of structure. She's called it Last Light in the Woven Hedge. She likes to paint a lot of pictures of hedges more recently. she says because hedgerows are disappearing. So, but it's around her house. I think it's in Cornwall, something like that, Devon. But she's got this, same sort of formula with the light in the center and the background there, and then this green area around the front. So the picture's got some structure. So basically think of that structure. And then she's using those similar kind of techniques, wet and wet to build up the textures, overlaying. Sometimes she said that she would overlay twigs and things like that into the picture to create, again, some different effects. This will what happens to the paint if you put a twig in it depends on how absorbent the surface is, and how long you leave it on. So if you say you had a wet, quite thick watercolor paint, and then you put a twig or a leaf into it, when you peel that off, you will get a relief pattern, which is interesting. And then when that dries and you put a watercolor wash over it, it will reveal that pattern. Playing around with different kinds of paint is useful as well. As we know with watercolor, some are very transparent, like Zillion Crimson, and then others are kind of quite thick. Like good quality cerulean blue. Some of the metallic ones. And she does also use some black as well. Black is useful because with certain colors, it can be more tacky, like Mars black. So there's like 3 kinds of blacks, Mars black, I definitely remember, ivory black, and lamp black. Now, they've got different qualities to them. So, maybe if you want, you can experiment with a bit of black into some of your pigments, because some granulate more than others. Granulation is just when you get the speckled effect, and others are very tacky, and they look a little bit like Indian ink. So they good for binding areas. Okay, so she's experimenting with these kinds of things, but it's a basic structure, as you can see, and that's the important thing. If her pictures would be too complex, too many elements to them, then the textures would just overwhelm everything. So she's keeping it simple so she can play around with all the textures. Same with this one as well. You can see this kind of line running through it. Again, she separated this in a initial drawing, so she's got this impression of the structures, and then it gives you this illusion of being in near a hedge or in a forest or something, like looking out across a lake of light or something like that. So this is all to do with textures and texture sizes. We can see some things happening here which are to do with plastic being laid on the surface, because plastic creates these kinds of angularities in the watercolor paint here. And then, by, you said, using the paint as we just described, letting it sort of have different kind of drying times, breaks the surface up in this kind of way. Another thing that they, Anne does to a degree, a little bit, but we're going to see when we look at a later picture, Shirley Trevane are using printing processes as well, like monoprinting. Now, some of you might have done a little bit of monoprinting and used monoprinting ink. It's slightly thicker, slightly more tacky, so it can be mixed with watercolor. Although they're mostly oil-based, but some are water-based as well. But by having an element of them in with the watercolor, it just pushes watercolor a little bit further, so you can create more effects. The only thing with all this is it is all about having fun and experimenting, right? But you have to just make sure 2 principles are in place. One is as I keep saying, a relatively simple structure to work on, and 2, just have an idea of 2 or 3 colors, base colors, because this is all about texture, and creating different textures. And we don't overload everything. And some of these pictures are bordering on being overloaded, you see. But it's all about creating that atmosphere within it and interesting things happening. So it's fun to play with these kinds of techniques. Another one, you're seeing like patterns in terms of the trees and the lights and the structures here. Unfortunately, this image isn't as sharp as I would have liked it to be, but it's it's done in this kind of way that we're seeing it on here. Another interesting technique with this as well is, and some of you have tried this, is to put layers of watercolor down, particularly thick watercolor, tacky thick watercolor. That could be some indigos mixed, maybe some elements of like earthy colors, sometimes like burnt umber, blended together. And when they're damp, laying them down, just washing it all off, nearly all off, and it'll leave a little kind of ghost of an image. Some paints, watercolors will stain more than others, and others will lift off different ratios. So again, it's about playing with that. I know sometimes the old picture just gets overloaded in this case, and then you just put it under the tap and see what happens, and it goes next to nothing. Okay, but if you have watercolors that have got shellac in them, like some of these Mars blacks, or you add gum arabic to your mixture, which is the binding agent, then they'll stick to your paper, so they won't all disappear. Okay, when you water it off, which is another way of experimenting. It seems like a lot of different techniques. That's because this is what these artists are kind of interested in. But for us, it's about playing and just remembering some of these things. I know some will go across the top of your head and others you land, and then trying them. And there's no substitute for trying these different techniques. And as you can see in this one, she's done the same kind of things in terms of the structures, split the picture in half with a couple of key verticals. So that's the structure. And then you've got this light area in the background and then slightly darker area in the foreground. So this time for the light area, once she's put the layers of paint down, sometimes she's actually going out into nature as well and using compost and things like that, the actual earth that's out there, mixing it, playing with it with the paint, because it just gives a natural feel. But she's also, you can see in this, as well as the earth, using different color inks. So you can see a sepia ink going here, elements of black ink. Now, sepia ink is lovely. It creates some sepia, breaks up into a whole host of other colors as well. So that's something to play around with. And then before she's put these flower shapes on top, she's just put a wash of gouache over the background. You see this white area here? That's just to separate the two areas again. So it's just push the whole area back. And it's just, you can see it just making these areas on the left-hand side slightly lighter. Then letting that dry. And then once that dries, then you can put these other shapes on top. So it is all about playing with these different drying times. Ink dries differently to watercolor. Ink, when you put it on a page as well, it doesn't necessarily move. It will stay on the surface. So you can put ink down and then wash off nearly everything else, but it will still keep the ink area. Again, it's another nice way of just creating layers in a picture. And then she's finished off this one with like a few little dabs here and there just to add a little bit of extra detail with slightly opaque paint. So that's just watercolor mixed with gouache over top of a dark area. Okay? So all those things are coalescing to create this kind of technique. It's interesting. And, experimentation is the only way into it. But we're seeing there's structure. There is definite structure behind it. In this one, you can see like the hedge again, but we've got the shape of a tree in the background. We've got the light, we've got the head shape, etc. And it's about playing with decoration as well. How light happens, how colours interplay with each other. How you create these different layering up effects in terms of letting one layer dry and then putting another layer on top of it, or protecting one layer while another layer is wet, and that protection could be with a bit of plastic, or it could be with masking fluid, as we said, anything like that, will create this layering effect. Mm, And, it's quite a large scope in watercolor to move from Indian ink or Mars Black, which is very dense, with shellac in it, or adding gum arabic in it, which makes it quite thick, right the way through to all the transparent watercolors to the other end of the spectrum, where you add gouache to it, which can add white and light to it, but it's also thick. So there's a lot to play with. And in amongst those whole range of colors and whole range of textures and whole range of densities, you can create these different effects through the levels of drying times and protecting one layer against another layer. And the only way to really find out about that, of course, is, listen to what we're talking about here. And I'm giving you the key elements of what's being used and the structures, etc. But then having a go, and having a go with the mindset of being open to what happens. And sometimes you do that and you play in that particular way. And what you see on the paper then guides you into what you actually paint. She's trying to fall some way halfway between those pure abstraction of letting paint operate on a surface and see what happens to semi-figuration. What I mean by that, she's choosing a couple of key things like flowers, trees, or a head shape. Okay, but simple things to enable that process to happen. And a myriad of things will happen, as you can see in this case. Same kind of subject matter again here. Trees, hedges, banks, suggestion of water, all coming together in the same way, in the same process that we just described. Watercolor washes going over a surface, putting these blues and purples down and overall shapes, letting that wet go to damp, then putting, the gouache over the back to create the light, gouache over the so we can see how these layering effects are all happening. And experiment with any materials you find as well. These nature painters, and you'll see with a couple others as well, they call themselves arborealists. Interesting, isn't it? But so they're one foot in what they're seeing in nature, of course, and then the other foot in abstraction, playing with these materials in this kind of way. So it is good fun. I definitely say that. And it's nice to experiment and play with these things because they can kind of just inspire ideas for you, Not only inspire ideas, but inspire you with the freedom of that as well. Textures are really important. Textures are really important. And it's a case of staying open to those different textures. Etching into the surface as well is very important because you can move from one surface to another. We started off with the first one where we had collage. So we had one layer added onto a top of another. Now, when you've got collage, of course, everything kind of paint works differently on it. But we're also, as well as collage building up layers to then put watercolor on, we're also etching the surface as well to let watercolor sink into an area, as well as kind of it's on top of the surface. Okay, so that's pretty much an overview of some of Anne Blockley's work. We went from the flowers to the nature pictures, and we're to discuss some of the techniques that she was using. And then we'll move on to an animal painter now called Haines. Somebody suggested we have a look at Jean's work, and it's lovely. It's lovely work in terms of the freshness of the watercolor application of the technique, as well as the compositions. We should proper picture the compositions of it as well. So that would be great. So yeah, we'll have a look at the way Jean Haines looks at the watercolors, and you can see that we've got a couple of key elements here. Now she does it in a way whereby there's freedom in her work. She really zooms in on the animals, often the head to try and get the personality. And one of the techniques she's done here, as well as zooming into the head and often quite a strong diagonal through the picture, we've got these very warm coloured eyes. So those warm eyes stand out against the coolness of everything else that is in the picture. So colour choices are important. Often talk about dynamism in pictures, and interest comes from opposites. So this case is warm against cool. But we'll see in Jean's work, it's also the spaces between the lights and the painted area. So she has a few colours which she knows will work in a palette. She experiments with them, whether they be blues, reds, or greens. And then she goes about putting the pictures together, whereby she doesn't literally paint everything like like you would see in a photograph, as you can see here. She deliberately leaves areas quite loose and free, and lets the viewer fill in the gaps. Then, okay? So she's in this case, we got a one eye, which which draws us in. It's red against the cool blues around us. Got a hint of the nose of the dog as well, with a dark in it, a dark against the light. So again, that draws us there. And then we've got the softness around the rest of the area. She's with the second eye, she's been aware that she's positioned it in the right place. So we know where that area is going to suggest an eye, but she's just left it to be a warm browny red color. Okay? So there's a looseness coming from this. The brush marks are important. Make sure you use the brush marks and put the paint on in the direction, in this case, that the fur is. Okay, you can see how these marks are being put on. And for additional lights, you can see she's just used a little bit gouache here and there, like you see up in this corner up there, and a few bits here. But she's left a lot of light in the corner of the picture as well. Okay, so it's a balance between some areas got watercolor in and other areas that's got the space. So it's not filling the whole canvas or the whole page or something. It's about being aware of the composition, leaving some light areas, some areas which are full, and some areas which aren't. And that's important as well. Again, you can see on this one, there's a lot of space left around the whole area of the fox here. It's amazing, you only need a few key things to suggest this fox, but the dynamic quality comes from that strong diagonal, and picking up key color relationships between the three marks of the nose, the eye, and the ear. But the rest of the painting is very loosely painted, wet on wet. Okay? The redness of the fur is just barely suggested. Okay? So one of the most difficult things when we're learning is what to leave out. Okay, we just generally put too much in, and then we go for too much detail. So it's a good idea to try and tackle a picture like this with just the essences. Just think of what the minimum you can put in, and then have the minimum you can put in and have the looseness of technique. She's showing that in this case, you just need a hint of a nose, an eye, and an ear, and this suggests a fox. Okay, so you don't have to put a lot in. As long as they're in relationship to each other, it'll work. Okay? So it's worth trying some of your watercolors where you just experiment with how little you can put in to still say what you want it to say. Okay. When you're starting from a photograph, it's very difficult because the photograph, whether it be digital or wherever, it just gives us so much information. So it is a good idea from your photograph, if you're going to do a watercolor like this, do a drawing next. Okay. And then don't work from your photograph, work from your drawing. Just the the key elements in, because then you kind of got no reference in for all the rest of the detail. And then you can be freer with your painting. And then just when you start putting marks down of your painting, let the painting then dictate to you what paint goes on next. Right? So that's the kind of process. That's a way of leaving things out. So you start with a lot of detail. You use a different, editing tool, which is our pencil on a piece of paper, because it's very simple to pick the key elements. Then you use that as your guide to then make a painting like this. Then you place those key elements of that drawing on the page and then let the paint be free. But being open to the fact that a lot of your picture will just be space around it. Okay? And that's not easy, because there's a definite tendency to want to fill everything up. But in this kind of way of painting, it's worth trying as a technique. See if you can do it. Even in something like this, we've got a lovely S shape, a lovely like swirly element there. But the design is nothing more than we're drawn into the eye here of the cockerel, and then we're just following a curve around it. But all the things I said about the way she's put the paint on is, with the fox, etc., is important. So we know that red comes towards us, so that's why she's got the key element in the center there. We know blue recedes, so we know we're going to have an element of depth in it. She's done a drawing whereby she's just drawn this shape around it. So we know what's going on there. And then when the paint is, she put the washes down, it's usually quite a big brush she uses. She does it in the direction of the feathers coming down into it. She might damp a bit of the paper, so it's a bit wetter in places. And then you get a soft running area, like we do in the center here. Now, some of you do this and paint like that. Others, it takes a bit more confidence to be able to put the paint on strong enough. You've got to be generous with your paint in this technique. It's the only way, because if you're not, and it's too dry, it won't give you anything. We need to use a lot of, enough paint to enable the richness of the color. And you've got to put it on bold, particularly if you put it in damp areas, because it's going to dry a lot lighter. It's the only way. She's also not afraid of these colors running back on each other, creating these clouds as well. They're a useful tool. Be open to them, because by nature, if it's an animal or it's nature, this cloudy effect around the outside, it creates a nice edge. It's a nice broken edge, which suggests those kinds of things straight away. Okay, so yeah, be open to those accidents. Here's another one. You can see it's interesting when you look at these artists' work. You see the formula they use over and over. In this case, it's the diagonal again. It's just a simple subject, one focus of the flower. Okay, and then just letting the paint wet move around it. Okay, but being generous and seeing light, light against dark. Okay, so if we need light, we put dark against it. Okay? If we need a sharp edge, we've got to make sure that what's in there is dry enough. So if we got light there and it's, we want to put something dark next to it, using our kitchen towel, we can take out more light, more dampness. So then we know that that's dry and the paint is not going to run into it. Okay, and keep the edge. Okay? This is a cold press paper with a texture, because we can see the texture, and there's some granulation elements going on in it. Okay, with that blue breaking up on the surface. But this is straightforward watercolor. There's not the techniques and the different kinds of layers of materials being used in Brockley. Okay, this is the lightness and the beauty of the paper playing a much bigger part. And the space being a bigger part of these kinds of pictures. And this one of this head, again, the shape is everything. The structure is, just putting the essence of things down. You can see how wet everything is pretty much gone on, but it's a controlled wetness. Okay, so you can see the early washes, like say in the background here with these blues, maybe it's indigo or something like that, touch of crimson. that's all gone on down into leaving to the light as we get further down here into damp paint. But then when that's dry, then this darker wash has gone over the top of it. Okay. And we know that because it's created a slightly sharper edge. But so the composition works, she leaves this light in the corner up here, and he leaves this light in the corner there. Which would be very easy to put paint over that, wouldn't it? To just carry that across there and carry that down there. But if you do that, you lose the dynamic in the picture. If you want interesting pictures, we need a full range of tones. So we got the light bright there, and we got a nice dark there. We got a nice light there and a nice dark there. Okay. So it's all about shapes, limited palette in this case as well. There's not too many colors going on. Okay. So you test a few colors before, 3 or 4 colors, something like that. And then follow in this kind of formula in this case. There's another one that she's painted outside. This looks like an Italian scene, something like Venice or Rome, of a building, whereby she's, used again cold pressed paper. You see, sometimes the paper will make a big difference. So experiment on different kinds of papers. Some are absorbent, some are not, and they create, fascinating effects. Having the right paper makes such a difference, or different paper. Sometimes you see things differently. Some will take more paint than others. She's flicked paint on this as well. You can see when it's been damp, the paint has just been flicked over areas. She's made sure she's left a little bit of a light area there and put it near some dark shapes. But overall, everything's relatively simple. There's a little bit of opaque paint going on there as well, which is quite nice, of cerulean blue or even a turquoise. It just adds interest to the picture. I can see that cerulean or turquoise in muted form is also down there. So it was in an earlier wash. And then later on, she's put it on more opaque there just to kind of add the dynamism of the picture. In this case, it's all about what's implied rather than all the detail. Like if you were starting off from a picture like this and you had a photograph of this building, which would be incredibly complex, be so much information on, you'll be drawn to all the window frames and the decoration and all that kind of thing. You can see you don't need it with this technique to make an interesting, nice painting. It's all about the editing out of the information. Not easy, but that's what it is. And a lovely little elephant here as well. She's got, a lovely character in the picture here, and she's got the basic structures, but the shape of the elephant. But you can see she hasn't done much drawing, like pencil lines or anything like that. She's drawn it out first, so she knows what the picture's going to be on a separate piece of paper, and then she's used a paintbrush to kind of find a way around it. And that's suggested by the width of the trunk there. She's just put a loose wash of this colour roughly where the trunk was. And then as it kind of dries, she's defined it a little bit, made it slightly thinner just by adding extra paint in certain areas. So it's having a dialogue with the painting while it's kind of evolving. She's tried to add a little bit of texture on this side as well. Again, that could just be scrumpled up plastic. Different thicknesses of plastic will create these kinds of effects. Put on, then let to dry, and then you put the wash over the top of it. Just layering up for interest, really. And then the warm against the cool. Not a lot of colours, but they're in harmony with each other. The essence of it is the shape. Eh? So Jean Haines really is about the diagonal, about editing, about what you leave out. It's about the light against the dark. It's about leaving a lot of the paper to shine the light against the dark. Okay, so it's that kind of thought process. Right, now let's have a look at Shirley Trevane. Her pictures are more complex on lots of levels. So Shirley, I think she's she must be well in her 80s now, 85, 86, something like that. I mean, she's been painting for a long time, and she goes to a great barber, as you can see. She's got a real style there going on. But her pictures are, as I say, complex, but lovely as well. Now, for something like this isn't a spontaneous picture. This is a picture that evolves over quite a bit of time. So she might set up a still life in her studio with key elements that tell a story that she wants. So might be geraniums by a window, but she's also trying to say more than that, by not just a light, but different objects. So she'll put different objects in to create a different narrative. She loves patterns. She loves shapes. She loves decoration. Okay, so these are all key things that work for her. So it's important to know what works for you, what you like in particular. Do you like particular drapery, or do you like, particular settings? Have you got some favorite objects? So she will set all those things because she's going to try and tell a story. So she goes about it then with the way of, she chooses a main subject, as you can see, geranium in here, but she compresses space a little bit like the Cubist did. So she's not adhering to one perspective. She's just putting one perspective against another from a design perspective. So you've got, say, for example, this flat duck in the front, and a flat window. And then, we've got the geraniums in scale so that they're placed in space. And we just jump between one plane to the other. She has complex light patterns, as you can see in this, which need balancing. So one of the ways you can do that is she spend more time drawing the whole thing out, so she's clear about the composition. And then she will lightly sketch some of the key elements onto a piece of paper, but then she likes to just let the painting evolve with these different objects that she's put together to tell, as I said, to tell this kind of three-dimensional story. She's not afraid to have patination as a dominant part of the picture, or equal part to the actual subject, which is the geranium. So it's just thinking about storytelling layers here. And then she'll put in amongst this, because they evolve over a little while, like little figures, like you see this little figure with a hat on there. There'll be these little things hidden within the picture. This can happen when you build up something in layers. And then she might, do a few hours on the picture and then put it away for a while and then bring it back out before she starts to put another layer on it. So, the time and the impact of different experiences is then built up on top of the picture. It's not like just all done in one sitting like Jean Haines was. This is the evolving process. This is a mono print that she's done here. Now, mono printing, some of you have said how to go. It's anything you basically put on a surface that's kind of quite tacky, that then you can kind of press onto another surface that leaves an image. Okay, there's lots of ways of doing it. Traditionally, it's everything from etching into copper or anything like that. But it is whereby you would, say, for example, cover a piece of cardboard that is got this plasticated, say a Tetra Pak or something like that, that we use for food. Okay. Then you put some acrylic on top of that, or some Indian ink or something like that. Then you draw into that surface, and then you press it onto your paper. And then you press it onto the paper, and it leaves an image. Okay. That's a simple way of creating a mono print. There's lots of other ways to play around, from potato prints to anything. Anyway, all it does, it just leaves another layer in the painting. And when you've got a mono print down, so you could do that with acrylic, or you could do it with oil-based pigments. Now, if you do it with oil-based pigments, they go on, of course, they dry. And then when you put watercolor with it, you create more and more layers. So that's interesting as well. So you can combine the two different mediums like that. but it adds depth and it adds interest. And if you're using printing inks, as you can see deeply in this, they're very rich as well. So you can get layering up like that. So this is a good example of how she evolved from pictures, sunset and behind the trees. And we talked about how paint, clouds out, but when you drop water into it and it creates these lovely effects. We can see the pencil drawing that she's done under there. It's very specific, It's, she's really observed the area that she's put down there, but she's just let the paint talk and tell the story of it. So it's been open to that effect as well. This is a complex one, as you can see. Image not as sharp as I'd like it to be, but you can see how much structure and composition's gone into that to make sure it all kind of holds together. All these shapes have had to be worked out so that they do all hold together. As I said, it's one flat shape against another flat shape. There's figurative images, figurative pieces like the jug against patinations, which are flat, placed together. So it's decoration against, a still life that would be in front of her. But you can see these diamond shapes. In this area, they're quite large, and in the background, they're quite small. So she's echoing patterns, but because they're small in the background, that's suggesting perspective. So she's playing with perspective on that level. So she's taking a pattern and using the pattern in different sizes to create perspective in the picture. So it's another way of adding interest and depth. So all those things can operate. And this is a watercolor, again, where she's just built it up one area at a time. Got to be patient with this. And you can see that in this. She also she likes to use a lot of black in her pictures as well. As you can see up here. That creates a lovely dynamic in the watercolors. Between that light and dark, we talked about it in Anne's work. It just creates a strong image in watercolor. When we think of watercolors, generally, I think sometimes when we start out, they're kind of wishy-washy. But, she's trying to use watercolor almost like she'd be using acrylic or oils to get the dynamic in it. But the white of the paper gives a tremendous white when you got those richness of a dark Mars black or something in it as well. There's a couple of things, as we said, the black absorbs a lot of the light, but when it hits the other pigments, some pigments like indigo and blue, it granulates a lot as well. So it adds a lot of interest in the picture. So this flattening process is clearly in evidence here. And as she developed her style, she became more and more interested in leaving more light and more light areas in her work as well. Sometimes I think her pictures can be so complex and so dense, you've got to navigate your way around them. And that's rich and lovely, but it's nice sometimes when she creates that space in it as well, so that you can relax and move from one area to another at a different pace. Right? So this is an example of that, where she's really left light areas on the left here. And on the right there, and this sort of self-portrait, or is a portrait of a lady having a fag, is saying everything, with just a pure shape and essence of her body language and her style. It's well observed and well designed. Okay, putting paint down, and that's the key in this shape. And some of these pictures are fairly big as well, a couple of feet high for watercolor, 2'6", 2 foot by 3. That's quite big. So there's a lot of planning has to go into that. But there's also freedom, because you can use bigger brushes and you can get different effects going on as well in areas. But you have to use all those techniques and be clear about how the paint's going to dry. Watercolor painting is often about watching paint dry. It really is. Is it damp enough? Is it wet enough? If I put something in it, is it going to bleed more, or is it not going to move? It's that kind of thing. So it is experimentation. So if you go bigger, your margin for error gets bigger as well. So that's another benefit of working slightly larger. You can let the materials, they got more space. The margin for error is bigger, which is nice. This is a good example of using black in the background to make everything else stand out, come out in light, which is great. Great structural design, emphasis on everything that we talked about, cubist elements, flattening everything, putting light against dark, like this leaves against those dark areas. That's all pre-planning. And sometimes she might not know what color to put these. So what she does, she takes old magazines and she cuts out colors from them and then places them on her watercolor painting in the middle stages just to test out colors. So she might not know what color blue that's going to be. So if you cut out a few colors, rather than risky just painting it color blue and it not quite working, cut out a piece of color blue from a magazine, try it on there. See if it works. If it does, then you can paint it in. Okay, things like that enable you to, with these complex pictures, make sure you get it right as it kind of evolves, and then structures there so she can just build up one area on top of another area. And in these ones, which are slightly later, she's trying to bring landscape into still lives. So she's called it Orange Sunset with Blue Flowers. So she's dealing with the atmosphere in a particular place at a particular time, which has moved her. In this case, it's orange sunset through a window, and she's incorporating that into the still life element. So that's another thing, it's kind of levels of abstraction. How do you edit a sunset down to key elements? In this case, a couple of colors, red, orange. Then how would you put the structure together? She saw it through a window, so there's a doorway window shape going off in the background. Pre-planning. Then she's got to have contrast between the cools and the reds. Okay, get that kind of balance together. It's going to flatten the picture because she's got so much red, because red comes towards us and blue recedes. But she's held it together with the red in the center. Now, the only way you can really test that is the method I just talked about, cutting a piece of paper out to make sure it's right before you move on. And then she's put other elements in the foreground, like a fence or a head, a kind of wall that she's seen. So she's taken the outside inside. So her still life, not just set up on a table and what she's put in a table with an arrangement of objects. This time, it's the landscape as well being incorporated to make those layers up. So you can do that. Think of that in that way as well. If you're making a still life, think about how that relates to the environment that is creating that still life and how you can pull those elements together. It all adds for more interesting opportunities. And in this case, she loves the decoration as well. This is all about decoration and those color balances, where we've got those sort of complexity of structures has to be worked out compositionally beforehand. Otherwise, there's just no way you can kind of pull it all together. Fairly large picture, but you can see how these tiny little marks here, this blue has been painted around these light strips in the picture. So that all has to be planned beforehand. Otherwise, there's no way of knowing how the whole thing will be put together. But this is a good example of her taking disparate things from her living space or a studio space, because as well as the flower in the center, we've got windows in the background of a certain size. We've got chairs of an interesting shape. We've got a piano down here, We've got decoration from things that she's looked around as well. We've got interesting panels in the background there. All part of her design. Then she starts to, starts painting it. Okay, so it's only by having that structural design beforehand that you'll be able to do something like this. The way it holds together, of course, is generally, in this case, the blue recedes, so the red holds it together in the foreground. So that creates some space and structure. But it's very complex, very complex indeed. that takes a lot of drawing organization and patience to build up something like that. As in this one, the other thing she likes to include as well sometimes are references to her experiences. She might put a postcard in a picture or a book that she's read, or a special object to tell another part of a story. So think like that. You can make a painting within a painting by including postcards and books and stuff like that. It all just tells a different kind of narrative. Structural, very strong structure in the picture, very strong design. Compositionally, red draws us to the center, surrounded by the light, and the design supports it around the outside. This all has to be pre-planned to enable that kind of work. So you have to be really moved by a particular subject as your starting point. Then you need an environment that you collect all these different kinds of objects, so they're there around you, for example, in your studio. And then you tell your story by experiences you've had and places you've been. And ways to do that is by including references to past, present, and future with the different objects that you include in the picture as well. And she creates this really strength and depth in this watercolor by using everything, as we said, from the white of the paper to the black of the watercolor. You see, she has a certain kind of color palette again, the reds, the blues, the oranges. Every artist generally has key colors that they particularly like, which makes their signature. But I see how she uses them here. The dynamic quality and the drawing, is very clear. It's very well kind of observed in it. And she lands somewhere between abstraction, cubism, and figuration, somewhere in the middle there, as well as like storytelling. You can see right in the center there's this figure with a head and an eye, nose, and mouth. So she'll put in these different references to portraiture as well, or a favorite chair or a favorite animal or something like that, hidden within the picture as the pictures evolve. All gives the viewer more interest, to find these kinds of things, and makes it richer as well. Tells a deeper story. And then on this one, lovely melody of blues all happening there. Structure's very strong, as you can see. Blues, golds, lights, darks. At the bottom, some incredible space, light space there to balance the whole picture, to make it kind of just be slightly offset. This is the painting evolving as it's going. So she's got an idea of the key elements she wants in a picture. But then as she gets further down, maybe she finds that, she's come to the end of the paper and she needs to get interest in it. So rather than taking it straight down to the bottom, she leaves lights left and right to make it irregular, and creates that semicircular shape, which echoes the clock. So just adds that extra level of interest. She's got a little postcard in there as well. So again, telling another part of the story. Animal references on the birds and on the decoration, nature references, landscape references, etc. All these things just add more and more interest. And there's another structural one with all those components that we just talked about: the darks, the lights, the structures, the little chairs. She likes chairs, so she pops in little chairs here, there, and everywhere. The scale of those chairs, different scales to give that depth in the picture. As well, and the layering up of a piece, protecting one area from the paint so that she can put wet in wet areas as well is important. Cauliflowers, key, anything like that to suggest interest. So all those watercolor qualities, being open to them. Okay, sometimes using opaque paint just to put little details in, or etching into a surface, lifting out paint, into damp paint, all those things, adds more and more layers. So there's an overview of those three artists with a lot of information, as you can see, but they are beautiful watercolors, and they experiment they try and be free. They try and push the medium and see where it'll go. So you have to be really free and open with your materials, really try them out. Consider your nature subject. So you've got to be clear about what subject, whether it be animals you particularly like, or whether it be hedges or a collection of objects or something like that. But just be clear about it. And, don't maybe starting off, don't make it too complex. Shirley Trevane is very complex. Obviously, she painted a long time. We can keep it simple.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell notification.